So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you guys through all of the bones of the skull and all of the skull landmarks, giving you different views of the skull bones because some of them you can see from both the inside and the outside, and then also walking y'all through the landmarks of the vertebrae and how to be able to tell the different vertebrae apart from each other. So we'll start with the skull first, and you guys did a really good job of identifying those skull bones on your own. So I'm going to help you guys give you some tips and tricks on how to remember some of these landmarks. So quickly going through the bones, at the very interior of the skull we have the frontal bone. When you look at the skull from a superior angle, you'll see the two parietal bones located on either side. If you turn the skull over to the back, you'll see the occipital bone being the most posterior bone on the skull. Coming back to the side, you'll see the temporal bone, which is going to surround the ear. The zygomatic bone, which is going to make up that cheekbone. We'll come back to that anterior view where we can see the maxilla, which houses the upper teeth of the jaw. The mandible, which makes up that lower portion of the jaw. Looking at the nose, you'll see the nasal bone that makes up the top of the bridge of the nose. Inside of the nose, you'll see the septum is made up of the vomer bone. And on the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, you'll see the inferior nasal concha. When you look inside the orbit, you can see the ethmoid bone located behind the lacrimal bone. So the lacrimal bone will be the one located most anteriorly in the orbit, and you can identify that through this little lacrimal foramen or lacrimal duct that's here inside the bone. And then immediately posterior to that, you would see that ethmoid bone. Now the last bone you can see from the outside is going to be the sphenoid bone, which is going to be located between the temporal and the zygomatic bones. So now going through those landmarks, we're going to start with the occipital bone in the back. There's three major landmarks that you'll need to be able to identify. The first is going to be the foramen magnum. So anytime you hear the word foramen, you want to think of a circular hole. So foramen magnum, magnum being very large, is going to be the large circular hole located in the occipital bone. That's going to be where the spinal cord passes through to exit the skull. On either side of that foramen magnum, what you're going to see are the occipital condyles. So condyles are going to be bone protrusions, so they're going to be elevations of bones. So located on either side of that foramen magnum, you see those two elevations of bone being the occipital condyles. Now the third and final landmark on the occipital bone is going to be the external occipital protuberance. The word protuberance is another out-pocketing or outgrowth of bone. And you'll see that as this rough patch of the occipital bone that makes that really significant sort of out-pocketing. So those are your three occipital landmarks. Now we're going to move on to the temporal bone. So looking at the skull from the side view. I use the external auditory meatus as my landmark to identify the temporal bone. So I know that the temporal bone is located by the ear. The external auditory canal or external acoustic canal or external acoustic meatus, it kind of has several names depending on what source you're looking at. But that's going to be where, if you were to stick a Q-tip in your ear to clean it, you would be going into the space here. The external auditory canal is going to lead you into the middle ear, which will ultimately lead you back to the inner ear. At the front of the temporal bone, coming off and making up part of the cheekbone is going to be the zygomatic process. I always remember this is the zygomatic process because its anterior articulation, or the point of bone that it meets in the anterior part, is the zygomatic bone. So the zygomatic process of the temporal bone touches the zygomatic bone itself. Next, we have a couple of processes. So anytime you hear the word process, that's going to be another out-pocketing or another protrusion of the bone coming off of that bone. So the first one we have is going to be the styloid process, and I'm just going to move this jaw out of the way a little bit for us to see. The styloid process is going to be this thin, skinny bone that kind of looks like a stiletto heel. So I always remember the styloid process because styloid sounds kind of like style. You think of style or the runway, you think of stiletto heels, and this protrusion, this landmark looks kind of like a stiletto heel. So that'll be your styloid process. Now, right behind that external acoustic meatus, we're going to see another process, which is going to be the mastoid process. Now, if you take your thumb and touch right behind your ear, you can feel your mastoid process right behind your ear. The last landmark of the skull is going of the temporal bone of the skull is going to be seen on the inside of the cranial vault. So we talked about the external acoustic meatus being the external hole that leads to the middle ear. Well, if you look at the temporal bone from the inside of the skull, on the lateral sides, here and here, you'll see the internal acoustic meatus, or the internal auditory meatus. So one here, and then you have one here. And so these will be located on the temporal bone on the inside of the skull. Now moving on to the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone is a really oddly shaped bone. So remember we saw it on the outside of the skull here, but we can also see the sphenoid bone on the inside of the skull. So the sphenoid bone is a bat-shaped bone that begins right behind the frontal bone, travels laterally, makes these bat-shaped wings, comes back down here, and then over to the middle, and then back around again. So the sphenoid bone has one landmark you can see on the inside. It has three landmarks you can see on the inside. The first is going to be the most center of the landmarks. It's going to be directly located in the middle of that bone, and that's going to be the sella turcica. So the sella turcica is this saddle-like landmark that's going to hold the pituitary gland of the brain. Now, if you look anteriorly or more towards the front of the skull, you'll be able to see the optic foramen. So remember I said foramens are going to be holes. So the optic foramen is going to be the superior hole of the sphenoid bone. Now if you follow my stick all the way exteriorly, you'll see that that sphenoid bone actually exits the skull through the orbit. That's going to be where the optic nerve is going to be carried through. Now if you look laterally to the optic foramen, what you're going to see are these slit-like holes on either side. These are going to be your superior orbital fissures. So your superior orbital fissure here, and another superior orbital fissure here. They're going to be located laterally. Now if you look at the skull back from the front through the orbit, you can also see those superior orbital fissures through the inside of the skull here. Moving on to the ethmoid bone. So we saw the ethmoid bone on the inside of the orbit here. Inside of the orbit here. You can also see the ethmoid bone from the inside of the skull. So let me bring it back to the anterior view. So the ethmoid bone begins here in the nasal septum, above the vomer bone. It goes up through the skull, and it comes out at the top through this frontal bone here. So this part here is part of the ethmoid bone. So I'm going to turn it back around because I prefer to look at the skull like from the top down, kind of posteriorly. So looking at the inside of the skull, we'll see the ethmoid bone here. This is going to be your cribriform plate. So you can notice the texture is a little different, and it's got these foramina located in this cribriform plate. That's going to be where the olfactory bulbs sit. So remember, the skull is going to be housing the brain. So a lot of these structures inside of the skull are here to help protect certain parts and processes of the brain. So that cribriform plate is going to hold that olfactory bulbs, and those foramina are going to be where the olfactory nerves are able to go through to the nasal mucosa. Now if you notice, there's this thin slit-like projection that comes up through that cribriform plate, and that's going to be called your crista galli. So the crista galli is going to be the part of the most superior part of that ethmoid bone that pokes out through the top. Next, I'm going to bring it back to the anterior view to look at that inferior portion of that ethmoid bone. And this portion here is going to be the perpendicular plate. So the perpendicular plate makes up the most inferior portion of the ethmoid bone, and it helps to make up that nasal septum as well. The last landmark of the ethmoid bone you can see on either side of the superior aspect of the nasal cavity. These are going to be your middle nasal concha. So don't confuse the middle nasal concha with the inferior nasal concha. The inferior nasal concha will be located more inferiorly in the nasal cavity, but still on the lateral sides of that nasal cavity. The next bone we're going to talk about is the maxilla. So the maxilla is going to make up the upper portion of the jaw, and it's going to contain these little processes where the teeth will be embedded into the skull. The maxilla has two landmarks that you'll need to identify. The first is going to be the body, which is going to be the dense bony part of the mandible that you see here. It's going to make up this upper parts of the jaw here. And then if you flip the skull upside down to view the upper part of the palate, the hard palate, this part of the maxilla, the more anterior part, is going to be your hard palate, also called the palatine process, depending on the source you're looking at. So, palatine process. The last bone of the skull is going to be the mandible. So the mandible is the lower jaw. It has these processes through which teeth are going to be embedded into that lower jaw. And there are seven landmarks you'll need to identify here. So if you turn the skull to the side and view the mandible from a lateral view, you can see the first two processes that you'll need to identify. The most posterior of the two is going to be the condyle. The condyle is going to be the part of the mandible that articulates with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Now, I'm just realizing I forgot to mention that mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, but that's going to be where the condyle meets. So right anterior or right in front of that external acoustic meatus, you'll see that mandibular fossa. And then nestled into that mandibular fossa, you're going to see that condyle. Now you'll notice another process that sticks superiorly, but it's located more towards the front of the face, more anterior. This is going to be the coronoid process. So the coronoid process is going to be an articulation point or an attachment point for several muscles of mastication or chewing. Next is the mandibular foramen. And to see the mandibular foramen, you have to look on the inside of the jaw. And you'll notice here there's this little hole on the inside of the mandible. Those are going to be your mandibular foramen. Here. Now don't confuse the mandibular foramen, which are located on the inside of the jaw, with the mental foramen, which are located on the outside of the jaw. So we haven't gone through this yet, but a lot of the anatomical regions have their own specific names. For instance, the outer portion of the jaw of the mandible is called the genio. The inside is called the genio region, but the outside is called the mental region. So on the mental region, you're going to have the mental protuberance, which will be the out-pocketing or the protrusion of the midline of the mandible. And then located a little more laterally on either side, you'll have two holes or foramina, which are going to be your mental foramina or mental foramen. Oh, I'm sorry. So you have your mental protuberance here, which is in the midline, and then located on either side, these holes are going to be your mental foramen. So mental protuberance and mental foramen. And then on the inside of that jaw, we have the mandibular foramen here. The last two processes are going to be the body, which is going to be the really dense, thick part of that mandible. And then the ramus, which is going to be this angular part of the mandible over here. Any questions about the skull or the skull landmarks? So what I want to do now is talk about the vertebrae. So you have three major types of vertebrae. Vertebrae. The most superior are going to be the cervical vertebrae. The ones making up the middle of the back are going to be the thoracic vertebrae. And then the ones supporting the lower region of the back are going to be your lumbar vertebrae. So you have seven cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. Now you might be required, or you will be required, to be able to identify each of these vertebrae when they're isolated or by themselves on a table. So I'm going to walk you guys through the landmarks of each of the vertebrae, and then I'm going to tell you how you can use those landmarks to distinguish the different vertebrae from each other. So first I want to take a cervical vertebrae and a thoracic vertebrae, and I'm going to use these two vertebrae as my guides to talk about the different landmarks. So first, we're looking at the posterior view of those vertebrae here. This is going to be the anterior view of these vertebrae, and then these are going to be your lateral sides. So located most posteriorly, this process that's going to point towards the floor on the posterior or back side of the body is going to be your spinous process. So if you ever feel the little bumps on your spine, what you're feeling are these spinous processes. Now if you look, these processes kind of make a T with the vertebrae. You can see it better with the thoracic vertebrae here. So going perpendicularly from those spinous processes are going to be the transverse processes here. So the transverse processes are going to stick out of the vertebrae in the transverse plane, going from left to right. Next is going to be the body. The body is going to be this big bony disc part of the vertebrae that you see here. This is going to give it its most of its integrity and kind of keep it together. Next, we have the superior and inferior articular processes. So I'm going to turn the vertebrae to the side so you can get a better view. And if you notice at the top, there are these flat ridges here that are going to be where the vertebrae articulate with the next vertebrae. So the superior articular processes will be facing in the opposite direction of the spine. So the spine will point towards the floor, and the superior articular processes will point up. And you can see them on the cervical vertebrae here and the thoracic vertebrae here. Now to see the inferior articular processes, I'm going to flip these vertebrae upside down. And you can see similarly shaped flat processes located on the inferior portion of these vertebrae. And this is going to be the same articulating point that's going to articulate with the vertebrae below that one. The last landmark on vertebrae that you have to identify is a landmark that is unique to the cervical vertebrae. So only cervical vertebrae are going to have this landmark. And that's going to be the vertebral foramen. I'm sorry, not the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is the big foramen, so I missed that one, so sorry about that. The vertebral foramen is the big hole in the middle through which the spinal cord passes. The next landmark that is only unique to cervical vertebrae is going to be the transverse foramen. So we have these, we talked about the transverse processes that are located on the sides of the vertebrae and that making that T shape. Well, if you look at the cervical vertebrae versus this thoracic vertebrae, you'll see the cervical vertebrae only has these holes on the side here. The thoracic vertebrae do not have those same holes. So now let's use these landmarks to talk about how you can tell the different vertebrae from each other. So when you look at your vertebrae, the first thing you should ask yourself every single time is, does this vertebrae have transverse foramina? Does it have holes within the transverse processes? If your answer is yes, it is 100% going to be a cervical vertebrae. So you can throw the lumbar and the thoracic out of the way. So now that we've identified that these vertebrae all have transverse foramina, let's talk about how we can distinguish between a normal cervical vertebrae, that would be between C3 and C7, between the C1 specialized atlas and the C2 specialized axis. So C1 is your first cervical vertebrae. It's going to be your atlas, and it's going to articulate with the occipital condyles on the base of the skull. This vertebrae is going to be completely flat. It does not have a body, as you can see here, but it does in fact contain those transverse processes. And so you can see these superior articular processes that would articulate with the skull, and then the inferior articular processes that would articulate with the next vertebrae. Your C2 vertebrae, your axis, is going to be your next specialized vertebrae. This vertebrae is going to have a spinous process. It'll also have a body, but coming off of the body is going to be a unique process that is going to be indicative of the axis or the C2. So this part that's protruding up looks like this little round knob. It's going to be a point through which the skull can kind of rotate around, creating like an axis point. So do y'all feel comfortable being able to tell the difference between the normal cervical, either C3 through C7, the C2 axis, or the C1 atlas? So now remember, our first question was, does this vertebrae have transverse foramina? Okay? So when you look at these next two vertebrae, the thoracic and the lumbar, you can see that neither one of these have transverse foramina or holes in those transverse processes. So we're going to move our cervical vertebrae to the side, and now we're going to work on being able to distinguish the thoracic vertebrae from the lumbar vertebrae. So my quick and easy way to do this is, because I'm cheesy, and I think that these look like animals. So the thoracic vertebrae looks like a giraffe, and the lumbar vertebrae looks like a moose. Can y'all see that? The giraffe and the moose. Now, this is not everyone's favorite way to identify vertebrae by associating them with animals, so I do have a biological mechanism on how we can use those landmarks in order to tell the two apart. So do y'all remember what these processes were up here on the superior aspect of this vertebrae? Yes, superior articular processes, very good. So the superior articular processes are going to be what you use to determine whether it's a thoracic or a lumbar vertebrae. So if you look at this thoracic vertebrae, you can see that the superior articular processes point posteriorly towards the direction of the spine. Okay, so you see how they open up towards the back, that spinous process. The lumbar vertebrae do not do that. If you look at those superior articular processes of the lumbar vertebrae, they face more inward or more medially than they do on the thoracic vertebrae. So either by telling, okay, this one looks like a moose and this one looks like a giraffe, or by saying, okay, these superior articular processes face towards the spinous process, and these superior articular processes face more medially and not towards the spine. Those are two ways that you can tell the difference. Alright, so let's recap. Which vertebrae is this? Cervical. C3 through C7. Very good. What about this one? Lumbar. Very good. What about this flat guy? C1. Atlas. Excellent. What about this one? Thoracic. Very good. And then lastly, C2. Axis. Very good. So then the last thing I quickly wanted to go over is going to be the sternum. The sternum's pretty easy. It's broken up into three parts. The most superior part that kind of makes a regularly square shape is going to be the manubrium. The middle part that makes this cylindrical shape is going to be the body. And then at the tip, you're going to have the xiphoid process, which is going to be right underneath where your ribs, where your sternum's at. And then lastly, we have our ribs. So for the ribs, you have 12 ribs. The first 7 are going to be what's called true ribs. They're true ribs because they articulate directly to the sternum. So they are going to be called vertebrosternal ribs. Vertebral because they articulate with the vertebral column in the back, and sternal because they articulate with the sternum anteriorly. They're also called true ribs because they articulate both in the front and in the back to the sternum directly. Now the next 5 ribs are considered false ribs. So these last 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, do not articulate directly to the sternum. These vertebrae are either going to articulate to cartilage that articulates to other cartilage that goes to the sternum, or they're not going to have any anterior attachments at all, as you see with the bottom 2 ribs. So the 8, 9, and 10 are going to be called vertebrochondral ribs because they articulate posteriorly with the vertebral column and anteriorly with the cartilage. Chondro is Latin for cartilage. The last two ribs are called vertebral ribs or floating ribs because they only have posterior attachments to the vertebral column, but they do not have any anterior attachments. They're just floating in space in the anterior portion of the chest. As I keep saying last thing, but the last thing is going to be the sacrum. If you follow the vertebral column inferiorly, nestled in between the pelvic bones, or the hip bones, is going to be the sacrum. The sacrum is essentially like a series of fused vertebrae that are a little more complex, but they still allow for spinal nerves to exit through this portion of the midline of the axial skeleton. So that's going to be the sacrum that's nestled in between those two hip bones. And then at the very bottom, you'll see this little bitty bone that kind of looks like a baby tail. That's going to be your coccyx. So that's going to be that last bone. Any questions?